Okay. Well, welcome. Big crowd today out there. I'm glad that Tyree and George went first. They take all the tough questions, so now we can just relax, and you're kind of tired from asking all the tough questions, so now you can just take it easy on me. How many folks, out of curiosity, are here for the first time today? Wow. Well, credit to the media folks for promoting this. Appreciate that. Go ahead and keep your hands up. We'll start to the right, like you'd all introduce yourselves. I want you to take a look here. There's right at this line here, there's a website. About 3 years ago, when I went to the Department of Agriculture, I started putting the long-range forecast just out for 3 months. That's as far out as I found this thing to have any kind of accuracy that makes it worth it. I put it on the Department of Agriculture website. You might want to jot that down. I'll have a slide at the end that has it again. And these presentations all get put up on the Oregon AMS website after the presentation, so you'll have a chance to download this and get that website. But I update this every month, and sometimes there can be some pretty radical changes, and last winter was one of those cases because we didn't know at this time how strong the El Nino was going to be or if it was going to persist as we went into last winter. And so my forecast has some pretty significant updates in November and December, and it actually updated and got a little better, which doesn't always happen. Sometimes you update it and make it worse. But it actually did get better. So again, you feel free to go to that website and get updates through the winter each month. There we go. If you go to the website, again, there's the forecast can be downloaded in either PowerPoint or PDF. And the latest one that's up there is from last month. That the new one hasn't been posted yet. I'm showing it to you here first. In fact, not everything that's presented today will end up on the website. But I'll update that next week with next month's forecast. And then I've got in detail my forecasting methods. And does this thing have a laser too on it? Yep. The middle, is that the middle button? Oh, it is. Okay. I've got the forecasting methods here in more detail, so I'll just briefly go over that today. And it's that analog method that George Taylor was alluding to. And then I verify each month. Jan Curtis from the USDA here in Portland suggested, hey, why don't you put up a verification each month? So I've been doing that. So I verify the month before and the 3-month forecast that I put out for the month before. So you can check that out. First, let's take a look back in time, take a look at last winter, see how that verified. We'll go through it quickly. Again, this is the forecast that was issued at OMSI last year, October 17th. And the precipitation forecast for November, I do it month by month here. And again, sometimes that creates a problem, as George was saying, because that's kind of an arbitrary cutoff. But it gives you a general idea. And it wasn't too bad. We're calling for a dry November, and that panned out pretty well. And temperature-wise, not too bad either for the month of November. Things started to go awry, if you will, as we went into December on the October forecast, because El Nino started to strengthen and we didn't know which way it was going to go, so my analog years kind of did both, and so they didn't have the real strong El Nino signal that came in later in the winter, so this did get updated. But I didn't really have a clear signal on precipitation, but it was already starting to go dry, a very classic El Nino signal, and it certainly did not factor in the real cold spell that we had that skewed the temperatures quite cold for December. By January, some of the analogs that I had, even some of the El Nino analogs that I had for last year were wet ones, which is really rare. And I mentioned that last OMSI conference. I said, I'm going against the trend for a wet January, knowing we might be going into El Nino, but I did it anyway. I updated that as I went into November and December toward dry, but the October forecast was for wet. But I did get the temperature not too bad. It actually ended up being even warmer than I had forecast. But in general, got the temperature part right. The precipitation started out okay, and then I had to update that wet stuff to drier later in the winter. But overall, not bad. If you take a look at the 3-month forecast for November through January, again, I call it wet because of the wet January that I had. Again, that got updated. But the temperature-wise, that's not too bad. Went for a mild winter indeed. That's what we had overall. Again, my forecasting method, I use a couple of indices, the SOI and ONI. You've already seen some graphics on what those are, Southern Oscillation Index, and the Oceanic Nino Index. The first one measures a pressure difference. The second one measures the actual ocean temperatures in that Nino 3.4 region. I use historical data from those years that line up with this year. to look forward in time and make general seasonal predictions. Sometimes specific events show up and you have a higher likelihood of those things then repeating themselves as well. I do not make corrections for any changes in global climate from the analog year to the current year. I know that climate is always changing. I just wouldn't know how to correct for that. So I don't. I'm not saying it doesn't happen. These are typical El Nino pattern. You've seen graphics on this where you have a lot of warm water in the equatorial Pacific. There's the anomaly. This is the classic El Nino to strong out of 1998. Notice how the warm water goes all the way to the coast of Peru. That doesn't always happen with El Nino. That's a classic strong El Nino. And La Nina of 1989, cooler tropical ocean waters, and there's a big pool of cold air that's closer to what we're looking at today. And in typical El Nino fashion, the subtropical jet stream is strengthened, the polar jet stream is not as strong and is diverted well to the north. The cold air dumps tend to be in New England during El Nino. We tend to get in between the jet streams. You hear the weather guys talk about split flow patterns, split flow. Well, that's because the subtropical jet stream is south of us and the polar jet stream is north of us. And we end up with rather benign weather in here, clouds but mild and not a lot of rain. With La Nina, as Tyree was pointing out, you end up with a lot of warm water and storm, or a lot of moisture being pumped into the atmosphere in the western Pacific. It's picked up by the polar jet stream and either driven in here on a southwest flow that comes around this blocking high, or you have a big blocking high and you get Arctic dumps that come down farther west and sometimes far enough west to get us. So we have lots of variation possible, but it can give us some pretty volatile weather. And it's very different look from up here. And this is the pattern we're looking at for this winter. It definitely skews wet, and again, the temperature pattern is not as striking until you get up in elevation into the mountains, and they tend to be significantly colder up in the mountains on a La Nina. This is a little bit confusing, but this is just to show you on the SOI. These colors represent pressure anomalies, not sea surface temperature or temperature. During an El Nino event, Tahiti's pressures are lower, Darwin's pressures are higher, and so it weakens the easterly trade winds and allows the warm water in the western Pacific to come back across the central Pacific. In a La Nina situation, Tahiti's pressures are higher, Darwin's are lower. This is what we have this year. The trade winds are strengthened and it keeps the warm water bottled up in the western Pacific. And that's a classic La Nina pattern. These are the analog years that I came up with, and what I look at, and again, there's different schemes. I have many of the same years that George Taylor has. What I look at is not a projection into the future. I've tried that. It actually makes the forecast worse. I look at what's happened over the past year and a half, because I theorize what regime we're coming out of is just as important as what we're currently in, because there's some momentum to the atmosphere. If you take a look back at La Ninas, the La Nina, as the previous speakers pointed out, they're not all the same. One of the reasons they're not the same is what happened just ahead of that La Nina. If you come out of an El Nino into a La Nina like we have this year, I have yet to see one that isn't wet. Sometimes we have dry La Ninas, not after an El Nino. I haven't seen it. This would be a first that I can see looking back in the weather record, so expect wet. Very high probability. No, nothing's for sure, you know that, but high probability. These are the years that I picked, and you can see on the SOI, again, if the SOI is positive, that's a La Nina situation. So we had kind of a pseudo La Nina a couple of winters ago. It was actually classified as INSO neutral, but it was right on the threshold of a back-to-back La Nina, and that's the one that gave us the snow. And then we came down into the El Nino. The solid line here is this actual our current trace, and then rapidly up, way up above the others at this point. And this is what George Taylor was talking about, kind of in uncharted waters, because it really ramped up fast. So there's no perfect match, but these were the best that I could find, and I agree with George in that the best match that I could find was the 72-73, which takes us into the winter of 73-74. That was also really, I thought, the best match. The ONI, Tyree showed you, is that Nino 3.4 region, 120 to 170 degrees west longitude, 5 degrees north and south. And here's the ONI. ONI positive means warmer waters. Now this is ONI positive means El Nino. So we came out of a negative 2 winters ago, and then we went up into that El Nino, and now we're rapidly going back down negative. We're about the same as some of these other years at this point. 72, 73 was actually colder in the ONI. So, but the same years line up fairly well that way as well. But notice there's no perfect match, there never is. And those subtle differences can really make a big difference. For instance, notice how the 97-98 El Nino was stronger than the one we just had. Now it lines up really well. What I like about it is look at the slope of those two coming right down together. I think that's important, but it's still not a perfect match because it would have more heat energy. El Niños put a lot of heat energy into the global atmosphere and water vapor. Well, that one put more heat energy and water vapor into the atmosphere, so it's going to have a different signal. This 97-98, we went into that winter, we had that enormous Arctic outbreak in the middle of December. It was dry, but we had it. So you look at that and think, well, maybe we'll see something in December. The 72-73, which is the winter 73-74, ended up having a pretty significant Arctic outbreak in early January. I think we're going to see one this year. I don't know what the timing of it will be, but it would surprise me if we don't get some Arctic air in here, because most of the analogs had at least, they didn't all have it, but most of them had at least one. This is that Australian Bureau of Meteorology again. Notice the pattern. This is the Nino 3.4, and so January 2008. That was a strong La Nina. And then the next winter was that one we got the snow, and it was right on the threshold of a La Nina. Again, most of our big snow's coming in so neutral. There's a classic example, although it was right on the threshold of La Nina. And then pretty strong El Nino, moderate, strong, I guess you can categorize it how you want. And then boom, look at the crash down. And so what I like about one of my analogs is 2007, 2008. Look at the pattern here to here. That's what I look for, is that similar pattern. Not exactly the same, because the amplitude of this one's bigger than 2007-8, but those are the types of things that I look for, and the years that I picked had that type of pattern coming out of an El Nino into a La Nina. So here was last October, and we couldn't decide if this El Nino was going to ramp up. The computer models were saying different things. It turns out it did amplify into what we call a El Nino Madoki. I hope I pronounced that right. It means similar but different, Japanese, meaning that the warming is just in the central Pacific, but notice how it doesn't extend all the way to the Peruvian coast. And there's some that theorize that these types of El Ninos are more of a characteristic pattern of a cold phase PDO El Nino, and they give you a different weather pattern than when you're in the warm phase. And George Taylor talked about that. So it's nice to have those guys kind of set it up so I don't have to go over all that. The La Nina pattern that we have now, the latest October, you've seen that with the cold waters here, so very different from last year, pretty extreme. Here's the evolution of it. We put it into motion since July, and you can see the cold is really advancing down here. The anomalies of cold are bubbling up, and again, forecasting get even stronger before the forecast is for them to, the cold anomalies to strengthen over the next couple of months. So what about the future? Well, it's a bit in question because my boy Aaron Rodgers here has got a concussion. We don't even know if he's going to play tomorrow, so, but we'll see. Here's the forecast going month by month, and again, it's tough to delineate, but there's general, I agree with George completely, turning stormy and wet. All these years turned stormy in November, pretty much without exception, and they had fairly benign October, so my climate forecast also predicted a mild October, very benign, and that's what we're seeing. And I just looked at some long-range maps yesterday, and they looked like maybe we're going to hit our storming period here in about a week, and then here we go. Significant mountain snow occurred by Thanksgiving in those analog years, so ski areas. How many ski area folks do we have here? A few. Now, they all showed some pretty good snow by Thanksgiving, but remember, I think it was 2007, we had that La Nina that you didn't get a whole lot until the middle of December, so it's not a guarantee, but I think eventually you'll see some pretty hefty snows up there. Temperatures favored slightly cooler than normal. Here's the pattern, precipitation, pretty heavy. And this cool west, warm east pattern carries through the winter, and I theorize why this is. What I did is I go through and I take the 9 zonal climate zones for all those analog years, and I just did a straight average of those. I didn't weight them, probably could have, but I wouldn't know how. But I mean, I know how mathematically, but I wouldn't know which one to give how much percentage. It just makes a mess. So this is an average from those. And what they show, the story this tells is if we have a stormy November, the clouds and rain will keep temperatures down west of the Cascades, but westerly flow coming off the Cascades is going to keep temperatures up east of the Cascades, and the clouds will keep overnight temperatures up because they won't be able to radiate cool. So it's a classic stormy temperature pattern. For December, then things ramp up. It's the same idea, but it's just amplified. Wet statewide. The cool west, mild east, that doesn't mean we're not going to have an Arctic outbreak. I think it's highly likely we will sometime from middle of December through the first week of January. I think somewhere in there we're going to get it, but it may only be for a couple of days and may not skew the temperatures tremendously. Although in 1974 we had a pretty big one that lasted 12 days. That would skew the temperatures. But I put at the bottom, I think one or more of the following are likely. Coastal windstorms. This is a pattern we get La Nina. We may not get the windstorms here, but the coast does. We had the big gale in 2007. This is a pretty similar pattern. You saw the drop. It looks a lot like 2007. We could see another pretty big windstorm on the coast. It would not surprise me. In fact, I think at least one or two moderate windstorms are likely, and a big one is very possible there. The odds go down in the valley. As Tyree was pointing out, the big windstorms in the valley tend to be more INSO neutral for whatever reason. Arctic outbreak, I think we'll see at least one. The valley snow piece, I'll talk more on that in a minute. I know that's what you're waiting for. And flooding, there's another one. A couple of the analog years had tremendous flooding in the western Oregon. If we get the Arctic pattern, get the snow in here, low elevation snow, then we have a high likelihood of coming out of that with another trough dropping offshore, putting us into southwest flow, pineapple connection, rain over snow, you know what happens, and you get the big floods. That is a classic La Nina pattern that can set up, so we're vulnerable to that this year. So I know the forecasters will keep an eye on that, on operationally. And there's the pattern for December, wet, and again, that'll be probably some pretty heavy mountain snow, and cool but not terribly cold, again indicating storminess, and generally low freezing levels. But that warms it up east of the Cascades when that happens. Doesn't mean it's terribly warm, but if they don't have Arctic air and they can't radiate out at night because of clouds, it keeps them warmer. January, there's no major change to the pattern. I think December, January, you could probably flip-flop them. One of them is going to have maybe some cold air, and the other one's just going to be storming. I don't know which. It's too tough to delineate that based on the analogs. But essentially the same thing. And notice the same precipitation and temperature pattern, a little bit more enhanced. And I'm going to give you a bonus February here, which I didn't last year. Not as volatile as December and January, but still stormy. All the analogs were not, they just weren't as crazy in February as they were in December and January. Kind of that hump that George was talking about, November, December, January, and then it starts to relax a little bit. The temperature pattern of cool west, warm east continues. This is classic. Notice the increased precip over the Cascades. That's upslope due to storminess coming into the mountains and dumping snow. And the cool, cloudy pattern, and then notice west winds off the mountains with clouds going to keep the temperatures higher there, especially north central. That's a classic west wind pattern. That's why that's there. So for November through January, the 3-month period, wet, cool west, mild east, and it doesn't change that much for December through February. And now to the fun stuff. Winter highlights. Well above normal precipitation, especially in the western zones. Average mountain snow, above average mountain snow, well above likely. Maybe, we'll see what happens on the top end of that. And then one or more of the following in December and or January, and probably more than one. We're just going to have some real volatile weather. It's going to be pretty exciting. The TV guys, you see that. Tune in to another storm. Good times for them. The ratings, TV stations make more money this winter. Get y'all watching. So, winter 2010-11 snow lights, new feature. I know that's what a lot of you come to see, so let's talk about it a little bit. Tough to read this. At least one Arctic event likely across most of Oregon. I don't know how long it'll last, somewhere 2 to 10 days on the analogs. Low elevation snowfall should be well above normal. Places like Corbett and stuff, places that are up in elevation, likely going to see some snow, pretty good amounts of snow, 2,000–3,000 feet and up too. The valley, again, I'm with the other guys. That's really tough to call. Some of the analog years didn't have much. Others had 10–11 inches of snow. Once you get the Arctic air in here, you've got a chance of that. The other thing that I haven't heard mentioned, you get the Arctic air in here, what about freezing rain? That's possible too. So it could be looking at some ice. If we get, breaking out, you usually get the ice coming out of the Arctic snap, so we have to look at that. So no guarantee of big valley snow, but watch out for For those of you that are new, I show this every year. This is, if you look at the date up there, September 2000. So I've shown this every year since 2000. It's the theory that Mark Nelsen was talking about, the broken clock is right occasionally, right? So if I put it up every year, Vince. The winter's big highlight is, and this is TV right now, it might surprise you. Have you heard that on TV? Winter's big highlight might surprise you. It is... I know. Yeah. I don't know which is tougher to predict, football or the weather, but I'm a big Packer fan, you know. You think maybe I get it from my dad. He's a Bear fan. I don't know what's going on with that. And a Duck. I'm a Beaver. But my mom is, my mom's the Packer fan. Lost my mom here a month ago. And that's, I have to admit, that's my Packer outfit she's wearing. It's too big for me even. On her, it's a robe. But this was taken last winter, and she loved to walk, and she's out there, and she's my biggest fan. I'll miss her a lot. So I would like to dedicate my show today to her. Thank you, Mom. I love you. I'll miss you a lot.
Just 2 minutes for other questions for Pete. Anybody have questions for Pete? I'm sure everybody does. Ron in the back row.
Pete, you're a brave guy.
He's a Packer fan.
Let me take off this.
Everybody's been talking about above average precipitation. Can you quantify that? Can you say mountain snowfall in the Cascades will be 10% above average, 30% above average, 8.5%?
Well, I think, I didn't look up those numbers and get specific. Part of it is time's sake, and I know, you know, I've got other things that I'm doing. If, you know, there's probably private meteorologists out here, if there's somebody that's interested in specific numbers that would, you know, be happy to calculate those kinds of things up, and, you know, that's how they make their living. But I think Tyree pointed out, you know, 3 inches above average on precip for Western Oregon zones. I think that's what he said, something like that. And that's the graphic that I had did have some quantitative. Those colors, it was tough. I went through it quickly. You can look at it more in detail, you know, on the website. But that's all like 3 inches above average. The snowfall, like George pointed out, you know, quantitatively on the snowfall, he didn't do it percentage-wise, but he showed it was, you know, significantly above normal. And it's this type of pattern that can give us record snow. I don't know if that.
Well, that might quantify then between 5 and 10% then, wouldn't it? If 3 inches is above the 37 to 40 inches.
Yeah, but that's 3 inches above average in a month, and the month might have an average of like 7 or 6, so you're more like 50% above average or more. In fact, some of the analog years had a 200% of normal for rainfall for December, January. So, okay.
One more right over here, sir. Yes.
What is causing the temperature of the ocean to go up and down as sets off the La Nina?
The question is, what is causing the temperature of the ocean to go up and down that sets off the La Nina? I think there's a Nobel Prize waiting for that person. That's a great question. We kind of know, we can track the evolution of it. We know when the trade winds strengthen, it bottles up the warm water over there, and that gets the process going. What we don't know is what exactly, we're starting to learn. We're doing a lot of research there, trying to figure out what are the causes. And I think there's a multitude of different causes. There's different things that can set off El Niños and La Niñas. And that's something that over time we're going to know more. Right now, we're mainly just tracking them, and we know the types of weather patterns they produce, but we don't always know what the cause is. There's some speculation with this you know, Pacific Decadal Oscillation. We see the patterns, like George was saying, where there's 30 years of a lot of La Niñas and not very many El Niños. And I've heard different theories that's due to the sun and different things. I don't know. I'm not sure what the answer is. And that's another wild card. You know, we talk about this quiet sun that's going on. You know, the solar activity is decreasing. Well, if that has an effect on the weather, then that adds air to this method because it's different than what it was during the analog years. And so then that we may be seeing things that we haven't seen. That it's going to act a little differently. So again, this isn't a perfect science. There's things I don't take into account that may have an effect on it. So I hope I answered that. You know, there's a lot to be learned.
And you'll be available for more questions afterwards.
Sure.
Right? All right. Ladies and gentlemen, Pete Parsons.